What if I told you that the loudest message you could ever send is no message at all? Not the perfect comeback, not the final argument, not the emotional goodbye, just silence. And for someone who thrives on control, that silence can become the one thing they cannot manipulate. Today, we're going to uncover what actually happens inside the mind of a narcissist when you disappear emotionally and never reach out again. Some of what they realize may surprise you, and some of the biggest changes don't happen in you, they happen in them. Before we begin, I want you to think about this. Have you ever spent hours wondering whether you should send one last message, one final explanation, one last chance for them to understand your pain? If that question has ever kept you awake at night, stay with me. Because by the end of this discussion, you'll understand why your silence may have said everything they needed to hear, and why it may have been the first time you truly reclaimed your power. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about narcissistic relationships is believing that silence is simply the absence of communication. In reality, silence can become one of the most psychologically significant events in the entire relationship because it interrupts a pattern that the narcissist has come to expect. For a long time, the relationship may have followed a familiar cycle. There would be moments of affection, followed by criticism, confusion, emotional withdrawal, or conflict. You would react by explaining yourself, defending your intentions, apologizing even when you had done nothing wrong, or desperately trying to restore peace. Every one of those reactions gave the narcissist valuable information. They learned what hurt you, what kept you invested, and how much emotional energy you were willing to spend trying to fix the relationship. Whether the interaction was loving or hostile mattered less than the fact that you remained engaged. Your emotional availability kept the cycle alive. When you suddenly stop reaching out, something fundamental changes. The predictable emotional exchange disappears. The messages stop. The explanations stop. The attempts to gain understanding come to an end. From your perspective, this silence may feel like an act of self-protection, but from the narcissist's perspective, it represents the collapse of a familiar psychological system. They no longer receive the reassurance that they can influence your emotions whenever they choose. Even if they never consciously admit it, they are faced with something they dislike deeply: uncertainty. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know whether you're angry, indifferent, healing, or simply moving forward with your life. That lack of information can feel deeply uncomfortable because control depends on predictability. When someone becomes emotionally unavailable, the usual methods of pulling them back into the dynamic become far less reliable. This does not necessarily mean that the narcissist is suddenly overwhelmed with genuine remorse or profound empathy. It is important to separate emotional loss from the loss of influence. Many people assume that silence instantly makes the narcissist realize how much they loved them, but relationships involving narcissistic traits often revolve more around maintaining control than sustaining mutual emotional intimacy. What they frequently notice first is not the disappearance of the person, but the disappearance of access. The familiar source of attention, reassurance, emotional reactions, and validation is no longer responding in the expected way. That shift can create frustration, curiosity, or even urgency because the pattern they relied upon has been disrupted. This is why silence often has a greater psychological impact than endless arguments or carefully crafted explanations. Arguments still keep both people emotionally connected. Every response confirms that the relationship continues to occupy your emotional world. Silence, however, removes that confirmation. It leaves no predictable script to follow, no emotional fuel to draw from, and no clear way to measure whether their influence still exists. In many cases, that absence speaks more powerfully than words ever could because it communicates something that explanations rarely achieve. The cycle is no longer being sustained. One of the hardest truths to accept after leaving a narcissistic relationship is that what felt like love to you may have represented something very different to the other person. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, emotional safety, empathy, and a genuine desire for both people to grow together. In contrast, relationships involving strong narcissistic traits often become organized around influence and control. This does not mean that every narcissistic individual is incapable of experiencing emotion, nor does it mean they never feel attachment. However, their attachment is frequently tied to maintaining their position in the relationship rather than nurturing an equal emotional connection. This distinction is important because it changes how we interpret their behavior after you stop reaching out. When communication suddenly ends, many people hope the narcissist will finally recognize their value and regret everything that happened. While moments of regret are possible, what often captures the narcissist's attention first is the realization that they are no longer directing the emotional rhythm of the relationship. Throughout the relationship, they may have become accustomed to deciding when conversations happened, when affection was offered, when conflict began, and when reconciliation occurred. They may have expected that after every disagreement, you would eventually return, explain yourself, apologize, or seek reassurance. That expectation creates a sense of psychological certainty. They believe the relationship will continue to revolve around their choices because it always has. When you never reach out again, that certainty disappears. Suddenly, they are no longer the person deciding when contact happens. Instead, they are forced to confront the fact that someone else has stepped outside the system they once controlled. For an individual who relies heavily on influence to feel secure, this shift can feel surprisingly significant. They may find themselves wondering why their usual methods are no longer producing the expected results. If they send a message and receive no reply, or if they attempt to provoke an emotional response and nothing happens, they lose an important source of reassurance about their ability to affect your decisions and emotions. This is why some narcissistic individuals may cycle through dramatically different behaviors after silence begins. One day, they may appear charming and apologetic, expressing warmth or nostalgia. Another day, they may become critical, dismissive, or even angry. They might attempt to make you jealous, seek information through mutual acquaintances, or present themselves as though they have completely moved on. These different responses can appear confusing because they seem emotionally inconsistent. In many cases, however, they are united by the same underlying purpose: testing whether they still have access to your attention and whether they can still shape your emotional reactions. The specific strategy matters less than the desire to restore a sense of influence that has suddenly been interrupted. Understanding this difference helps explain why endless conversations rarely create lasting change in these dynamics. If the primary concern is maintaining influence rather than building mutual understanding, then every emotional discussion can unintentionally reinforce the very pattern you are trying to escape. Choosing not to re-enter that cycle changes the balance completely because it removes the opportunity to continue directing your emotional responses, leaving them without the certainty and control they once assumed would always be available. One of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic relationships is the concept of emotional supply. Many people hear this idea and assume it refers only to admiration or compliments, but the reality is much broader. Emotional supply includes any form of attention that reinforces the narcissist's sense of importance or influence. Praise certainly plays a role, but so do arguments, emotional pleas, repeated forgiveness, constant reassurance, and even visible heartbreak. If your thoughts, emotions, and energy consistently revolve around them, they remain at the center of your psychological world. That position can become deeply reinforcing because it confirms their significance and maintains the dynamic they have come to expect. During the relationship, you may have believed that your efforts to explain yourself, resolve misunderstandings, or save the connection were acts of love. You might have spent hours analyzing conversations, sending thoughtful messages, or trying to convince them to see your perspective. From your point of view, these actions reflected commitment and hope. Yet every emotional investment also demonstrated that they still had access to your attention. Whether you were expressing affection, frustration, disappointment, or desperation, your focus remained fixed on them. This constant engagement often became a reliable source of validation, not because every interaction was pleasant, but because every interaction confirmed that they still occupied a central place in your emotional life. This is why conflict can sometimes continue for much longer than expected in narcissistic relationships. Most people think arguments happen because two individuals genuinely want to solve a problem. In healthier relationships, that is often true. However, when narcissistic patterns are involved, conflict itself can become a way of preserving connection. Every disagreement creates another opportunity for communication, another chance to defend themselves, shift responsibility, or draw you back into explaining your feelings. As long as you remain emotionally engaged, the relationship continues to provide attention, even if that attention is filled with pain and confusion. When you stop reaching out completely, that stream of emotional energy suddenly disappears. There are no more lengthy explanations to respond to, no emotional reactions to provoke, no reassuring messages to expect, and no repeated attempts from you to repair what has already been damaged. This change can feel surprisingly significant because the familiar source of attention has been removed. Instead of receiving a steady flow of emotional investment, they encounter silence, and silence offers very little to engage with. It provides no argument to challenge, no apology to accept or reject, and no obvious sign that they still occupy the same emotional space in your life. For this reason, some narcissistic individuals may attempt to re-establish contact in ways that seem confusing or contradictory. They may suddenly become unusually kind, offer unexpected apologies, reminisce about happier moments, or reach out with seemingly casual questions. Others may criticize you, spread rumors, express anger, or behave as though they are completely unaffected. Although these responses look very different on the surface, they often serve a similar purpose, testing whether the emotional connection can be reactivated. If you respond with strong emotion, whether positive or negative, the familiar pattern begins to return. When there is no response, however, the emotional supply they once depended upon is no longer available in the way they had come to expect. One of the most uncomfortable experiences for a person with strong narcissistic traits is uncertainty. While everyone encounters uncertainty in life, many people learn to tolerate it by trusting relationships, communicating openly, and accepting that they cannot control every outcome. A narcissistic individual, however, often experiences uncertainty very differently. Much of their confidence depends on feeling that they understand how other people will respond to them. They become accustomed to predicting reactions, anticipating behaviors, and believing they can influence the emotional direction of a relationship. When someone consistently responds in familiar ways, that predictability creates a sense of psychological stability. They know which words are likely to provoke guilt, which gestures will encourage forgiveness, and which behaviors will keep the relationship moving in a direction that benefits them. Over time, these patterns can become deeply ingrained. If every disagreement ends with you reaching out first, they begin to expect that outcome. If every period of silence is eventually broken by your message, they come to see that as part of the relationship's rhythm. Even your emotional reactions, whether tears, frustration, or repeated attempts to explain yourself, become predictable responses that reassure them they still understand how to influence the situation. This predictability often gives them confidence because they rarely have to question whether their actions will produce the desired result. The relationship starts to feel less like a partnership between two equal people and more like a system whose responses they believe they can anticipate. Everything changes when you stop reaching out entirely. Your silence introduces a variable they cannot easily interpret. They no longer know what you're feeling, what decisions you've made, or whether you've emotionally detached from the relationship. They cannot tell if you're still thinking about them, whether you've found peace, or whether someone else has become an important part of your life. Unlike arguments or emotional conversations, silence offers almost no information. It provides no clues about your state of mind and no opportunity to measure whether their influence still exists. For someone who has relied on emotional predictability, this lack of information can become deeply unsettling because they are no longer able to calculate the next move with confidence. This uncertainty may lead them to seek information in indirect ways. They might check your social media, ask mutual friends about you, revisit old conversations, or create reasons to contact you. Sometimes these actions are less about genuine curiosity and more about reducing the discomfort that uncertainty creates. Knowing where you are emotionally helps restore a sense of control, while not knowing leaves them confronting a situation they cannot easily manage. Even if they never admit feeling unsettled, the inability to predict your behavior can challenge the confidence they once had in their ability to direct the relationship. What makes silence so psychologically powerful is that it removes the script they had come to rely upon. There is no argument to win, no explanation to dismiss, no apology to manipulate, and no emotional reaction to measure. Instead, they are left with unanswered questions that cannot be resolved through the familiar strategies that once worked. The certainty they depended on begins to dissolve because the person they believed they understood is no longer participating in the predictable pattern that gave them confidence in the first place. If this conversation is helping you understand these patterns in a new way, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with one word: freedom. That single word isn't about someone else's behavior. It's about remembering where your energy belongs. Now, let's continue. When someone stops reaching out to a narcissistic individual, it is not uncommon for attempts at reconnecting to follow. Many people are caught off guard by this because they assume that ending communication means the relationship has simply ended for both sides. However, when the usual flow of attention and emotional engagement suddenly disappears, some narcissistic individuals may try to restore the connection. These attempts can take many different forms, and understanding the psychology behind them is often more useful than focusing only on the specific behavior. The goal is not always to rebuild a healthy relationship. In many cases, the goal is to determine whether access, influence, or emotional responsiveness is still available. One of the most common approaches is charm. Someone who was previously cold, dismissive, or critical may suddenly become warm, affectionate, and attentive. They might send thoughtful messages, reminisce about happy memories, offer compliments, or speak as though they have finally understood your perspective. To someone who has spent months or even years hoping for this kind of acknowledgement, these changes can feel deeply convincing. It is natural to wonder whether they have truly changed. While genuine personal growth is always possible for anyone willing to engage in honest self-reflection and sustained effort, meaningful change is typically demonstrated through consistent actions over time, not through a sudden shift that appears only after access to the relationship has been lost. If warmth and charm do not produce the desired response, guilt may become the next strategy. They might remind you of everything they have done for you, suggest that you are abandoning them during a difficult time, or imply that your decision to remain silent is cruel or unfair. These messages are designed to awaken your sense of responsibility and compassion. If you have spent much of the relationship prioritizing their emotional needs above your own, guilt can become a particularly powerful force because it encourages you to question whether protecting yourself is somehow selfish. When guilt fails, anger or criticism may emerge instead. They may accuse you of being immature, unforgiving, or emotionally unstable. Some may attempt to provoke a reaction through insults, blame, or exaggerated accusations. Although these behaviors appear very different from charm, they often serve a similar psychological purpose. Any emotional response, whether defensive, apologetic, or angry, confirms that they still have the ability to affect your emotional state. In that sense, the specific emotion matters less than the fact that you are emotionally engaged once again. Some individuals choose more indirect methods. They may contact mutual friends, interact with your social media in subtle ways, or create situations where an unexpected encounter seems possible. Others may present themselves as though they have completely moved on, hoping that displays of happiness or success will draw your attention and encourage you to re-establish contact. These behaviors can seem confusing because they shift rapidly from affection to hostility, from closeness to distance. Looking beneath the surface often reveals a common thread. They are searching for evidence that the emotional connection remains active. Your continued silence removes the reassurance they are seeking and leaves them without the predictable responses they once relied upon to maintain their sense of influence. One of the most profound shifts that occurs when you stop reaching out to a narcissistic person is not what happens in their mind, but what happens in yours. For a long time, the relationship may have conditioned you to believe that your emotional well-being depended on their responses. A kind message could make your entire day feel hopeful, while a cold remark or a period of silence could leave you questioning your worth. Without realizing it, you may have gradually handed over the power to determine how you felt about yourself. This is one of the most damaging effects of an unhealthy relational dynamic, because your sense of stability becomes tied to someone else's unpredictable behavior rather than your own values, judgment, and emotional resilience. When you choose not to reach out anymore, you begin breaking that pattern. At first, this decision rarely feels empowering. In fact, it often feels uncomfortable, frightening, and emotionally disorienting. You may find yourself constantly checking your phone, wondering whether they will contact you, replaying old conversations, or questioning whether you made the right decision. These reactions are completely understandable because your mind has become accustomed to seeking resolution through the relationship. Silence interrupts that habit, and like any deeply ingrained pattern, it can take time before your nervous system adjusts to the new reality. As the days and weeks pass, however, something important begins to change. Every time you resist the urge to send another message, explain yourself, or ask for closure, you prove to yourself that you are capable of tolerating the discomfort without returning to the cycle. This may seem like a small act, but psychologically it is significant. Instead of relying on the other person to reduce your anxiety, you begin developing confidence in your own ability to manage difficult emotions. That confidence gradually becomes stronger than the temporary relief that another conversation might have provided. This internal shift also changes the balance of the relationship in ways that are often invisible at first. Previously, the narcissistic individual may have expected that enough silence, criticism, affection, or emotional pressure would eventually draw you back into contact. Those expectations were based on past experiences where similar strategies had worked before. When you consistently refuse to re-enter the familiar cycle, those expectations become less reliable. The predictable pattern that once gave them a sense of influence begins to disappear, because your choices are no longer driven by the emotional reactions they hope to create. Perhaps the most meaningful transformation is that your identity slowly becomes separate from the relationship itself. Instead of measuring your worth by whether they miss you, apologize, or acknowledge your pain, you begin evaluating your life through a different lens. Your attention shifts toward your own goals, your health, your friendships, your interests, and the parts of yourself that may have been neglected while you were trying to maintain the relationship. This process does not happen overnight, and it is rarely linear. There may still be moments of grief, longing, or self-doubt, but those moments gradually lose their ability to define your choices. As your emotional independence grows, the influence the relationship once held over your thoughts, decisions, and sense of self continues to diminish, allowing your energy to return to the person who has always needed it most: you. One of the most important things to understand when discussing narcissistic behavior is that there is no single reaction that applies to every individual. People often search for a simple answer, hoping to know exactly what a narcissist will think or do when they never hear from you again. The reality is far more complex. Narcissistic traits exist on a spectrum, and every person has a different personality, life history, level of emotional awareness, and set of circumstances. Because of these differences, their reactions to your silence can vary significantly. Assuming that every narcissistic individual will desperately try to return, or that every one of them will immediately forget you, creates unrealistic expectations that can interfere with your own healing. Some narcissistic individuals may quickly redirect their attention towards someone else. If they have another source of admiration, validation, or emotional engagement readily available, they may appear to move on with remarkable speed. To the person left behind, this can feel deeply painful because it may seem as though the relationship meant nothing. However, moving on quickly does not necessarily reflect emotional health or genuine closure. In some cases, it reflects a pattern of seeking external validation to avoid uncomfortable emotions or to maintain a consistent sense of importance. Replacing one relationship with another is not the same as processing loss in a healthy and reflective way. Others may respond very differently. Instead of moving on immediately, they may intensify their efforts to reconnect. They might send unexpected messages weeks or even months later, attempt to recreate old conversations, or suddenly express emotions they never showed during the relationship. Some may apologize, promise change, or describe how much they miss you. Others may become angry, accuse you of abandoning them, or criticize your decision to remain silent. These contrasting reactions can seem confusing, but they often arise from the same underlying discomfort with losing access to someone who was once emotionally available. There are also individuals who alternate between these responses. They may disappear for a period of time, only to return unexpectedly when another relationship ends or when they feel uncertain about their current circumstances. This pattern can create false hope because each return may appear to signal personal growth or renewed commitment. Yet without sustained self-reflection, accountability, and consistent behavioral change, repeated cycles of leaving and returning often recreate the same unhealthy dynamics rather than establishing a healthier relationship. Recognizing these differences is essential because it prevents you from becoming preoccupied with predicting someone else's behavior. It is easy to spend months analyzing every possibility, wondering whether they will contact you again or whether they have truly moved on. While these questions are understandable, they can also keep your attention focused on the very person you are trying to detach from emotionally. The healthier perspective is to accept that their response is influenced by factors you cannot fully know or control. Whether they intensify their efforts to reconnect, quickly seek validation elsewhere, or remain completely silent, those reactions reveal more about their own coping patterns than they do about your value or the significance of the relationship. Understanding that every narcissistic individual responds differently allows you to let go of the need for certainty and place your focus where it belongs, on your own recovery, rather than on trying to predict someone else's next move. Perhaps the most important misunderstanding about silence after a narcissistic relationship is the belief that its purpose is to make the other person suffer. Many people reach a point where they feel deeply hurt, exhausted, and emotionally depleted, and it is understandable that they hope their absence will finally make the other person recognize what was lost. They imagine that staying silent will inspire regret, trigger guilt, or lead to a dramatic realization that changes everything. While those outcomes are possible in some situations, making them the primary goal of your silence keeps your emotional focus centered on the other person's reactions. Even though communication has stopped, your peace still depends on what they think, feel, or eventually decide to do. In that sense, the emotional attachment has not truly ended, it has simply taken a different form. As we come to the end of this conversation, remember one simple truth. Silence is not about winning a psychological battle, it is about ending one. You cannot control what another person realizes, whether they feel regret or whether they ever understand the pain they caused. What you can control is the decision to stop sacrificing your peace in the hope that someone else will finally change. If you've spent months or even years believing that one more conversation, one more explanation, or one more chance would bring the closure you deserve, consider this possibility. Perhaps closure was never waiting for you in their response. Perhaps it was waiting in the moment you stopped chasing it. Your silence is not a sign of weakness. It is the quiet confidence that says, I no longer need to convince someone of my worth. It is choosing self-respect over endless justification, emotional freedom over emotional exhaustion, and inner peace over constant uncertainty. Whether the narcissist reaches out again or never contacts you at all, your healing does not have to depend on their choices. Every day you choose yourself, every boundary you honor, and every moment you refuse to return to unhealthy patterns is another step toward rebuilding the life that belongs to you. So if there is one message to take away from today, let it be this. The most powerful realization in this story is not what the narcissist discovers when you never reach out again. It is what you discover about yourself. You discover that your value was never determined by someone else's attention. Your voice never needed another person's permission to matter, and your future was never meant to be held hostage by a relationship that repeatedly asked you to lose yourself. Thank you for watching. If this discussion gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear these words today. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What has silence taught you about your own strength? Until next time, take care of yourself, protect your peace, and never underestimate the quiet power of walking forward without looking back.